idea, which people are probably more familiar with. And basically this is all about not forgetting 504, making sure that you keep it in mind and can make use of it and advocating for your kid. So Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of '73 is a civil rights law. And it is originally based on the 14th Amendment, which gives equal protection to everybody under the law. In other words, if you're paying taxes for schools, or you get to ride the bus or whatever it is, whether you're black or Latino or you have a disability or whatever it is, you have the right, the same right as anybody else to use it. They don't get to make you live in a society, at least supposedly, they don't get to make you live in a society and say, well, you get these privileges and you don't get these privileges. So that's the basis of it. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Topeka, Board of Education, that separate education was inherently unequal. So if you look at the decision and you just change, substitute the word person with a disability for Negro, when you see it in that decision, you realize that the 14th Amendment and the Supreme Court have basically ruled back in '54 that if you have a disability, you are entitled to be educated along with other people, and you're not supposed to be shoved off in a warehouse somewhere else and done out of the things that everybody else has. Anyway, they connected the dots and started issuing court decisions. In Pennsylvania, I know of one, I didn't look it up for this, in '71, another one in '72 somewhere else, in which they said that's exactly what the Brown decision means for disabled people. And if you're not educating people with disabilities properly, if you're discriminating against them on account of their disabilities, you're wronging them and you're violating their civil rights. So in 1973, 504 was passed to basically put some legislative teeth into those decisions. So it's a civil rights law. It's not like IDEA, which is basically a funding statute that basically says, well, what are we going to do to educate special ed kids? There are certain civil rights type of aspects to IDEA, but it's not really a civil rights law in the same sense as, say, the Civil Rights Act of '64 or the Americans with Disabilities Act. For example, in civil rights laws, retaliation is a very big thing, and that's not really the case in IDEA. So 504, you have a right to those rights all the time. And when you have an IEP, that's fine. You still have your rights under 504, and it's important not to forget them. So 504 is enforced by offices for civil rights in various government agencies. The one we're most familiar with is the Office for Civil Rights that belongs to the U.S. Department of Education. And when we may go see our complaints, that's usually where we go. 504 applies to any entity that receives any federal money in any way whatsoever. Whether you receive a check from the feds, whether you receive a check from the state and they got it from the feds, whether you received a check from an agency that received it from the state, that received it from the feds, if somehow or other it can be traced back to the feds, then you are a recipient under 504. So that means, for instance, that regional centers are recipients under 504. They have a California fair hearing process and everything, but you should never forget that they're subject to 504. And if they violate 504, then you can go to the Health and Human Services OCR and enforce that. They're supposed to have a grievance procedure under Title 45 of the Code of Federal Regulations. It's 84.7. They're supposed to have a grievance procedure and a compliance officer. I'm not sure that all the regional centers do, but they're supposed to, and you can make something of it. So, we're concerned most of the time with the U.S. Department of Education regs because we're dealing with schools. The U.S. DOE regs have much more specifically school-related stuff in them. The interesting ones are 104.32, which is the child fine regulation. Child fine means that the district is supposed to look around for kids that have disabilities. They're not supposed to pretend that they're there. They're not supposed to wait until the parent comes into the principal's office and throws a temper tantrum. They're supposed to look for the kids. If they don't actually look for the kids, they're violating the law. The free appropriate public education requirement is at 104.33. And it is very general, in fact. The kid is supposed to get whatever special education and related services are needed to be able to get the same kind of access to their curriculum that other kids do. That stuff just sits there. If your kid has a disability, whether or not he's qualified under IDEA, whether or not he has an IEP, it's all the same thing. They owe him that. 104.34 is the least restrictive environment rule. And that basically says you can't warehouse the kid, you can't segregate him, you can't put him off someplace else because he's inconvenient. You got to, as far as possible, let him into the community. 104.35 is very important because it says that when a kid comes, he needs to be assessed. He needs to be assessed properly, too. You can't just sort of throw some little thing at him. You have to use proper instruments. The language is quite similar, actually, to what's in IDEA. It's not quite as detailed, but it's really there. So we had somebody in the last class that said, well, the teacher says, my kid has a learning disability. I think it was, what was it? Maybe it was dyslexia or something. I forget what it was. It was one of those things. The teacher says, oh, yeah, but it's no problem. It's not interfering with his education. What was the basis for the teacher saying that? Just the teacher's opinion? I don't think so. 104.35 says they got to assess. They can't just sort of give you an opinion off the back of their pants. 104.36 is the procedural safeguards. They're much less detailed, but the nice thing about 104.36 is that it provides for a due process hearing under 504. It's not the same thing at all as the IDEA due process hearing. It's put on by the district, and they have to come up with a hearing officer, and you can raise specifically 504 related issues. And many times the 504 related issues are much simpler than IDEA. We have a case, for example, where if we have to go to IDEA for the thing, we'd have a terrible time. Because they can talk about how expert their witnesses are, and blah, 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 blah. And without an attorney, we'd probably lose. Under 104, it's a lot simpler. 104.36 is a lot simpler. The kid went in there reading at a grade 3.5 grade level. He came out of there at the end of the year reading at a grade 3.5 grade level. This is a 9th grade kid. In 9th grade, if you're reading at a 3rd grade level, you might as well be outside the building. So what they did is, by failing to teach him how to read, they denied him access to the high school curriculum. Same thing as if the kid has a wheelchair and he can't roll into the building. So under 104.36, under Section 504, you handle that as an access issue. It's not an issue of, well, they didn't do it appropriately, or, well, they didn't put in the right accommodations, or, well, because then they come back and they say, oh, but we did, and the kids this and that. And under IDEA, they can go through all kinds of things and get very complicated. And they can talk about all kinds of educational expertise. But if they didn't teach the kid how to read, and he's in high school, it's like they didn't let him in the building. So much simpler issue. So many times, that's the way you want to go. The other thing is that retaliation is forbidden. And I quoted here from a finding letter from the Office for Civil Rights in a case in North Carolina, where, as I remember, they weren't letting they got mad at the parent and they wouldn't let the parent talk to the teachers. He had to talk to the principal. So anyway, he went and he complained to OCR, and the OCR finding letter said this. To establish retaliation, OCR first determines whether, 1, the complainant engaged in a protected activity. 2, the district had knowledge of the complainant having engaged in the activity. 3, the district took adverse action against the complainant. And 4, there was some evidence of a causal connection between the adverse action and the protected activity. So that at least makes it look like that's what happened. And then they see if the district gives reasons, are the reasons are a pretext or an excuse. Now, what's a protected activity? Protected activity is defined as basically standing up for your rights. If you file a complaint, if you say you're going to file a complaint, if you dispute something that they want to do, if you demand an IEP meeting, any of that kind of stuff is protected activity. If you get mad and start handing out flyers in front of the school, all of that kind of stuff is protected activity. They don't have to like it, but it's protected activity. If they strike back at you for doing that, that's retaliation, and they're on their way to an OCR complaint and spending a few $1,000 to fight it and probably lose. So the retaliation thing is very important. It makes them behave themselves. It keeps them from intimidating you and your kid. And that takes me to my next page, and this is protections for kids and the school staff. We had a great Ninth Circuit Court decision. I guess I should mention how the courts work, just briefly. You have a state court system that ends up at the top at the California Supreme Court. You have a parallel federal system in which you have federal district courts, and then you have the circuit courts over them, which are appeals courts, which answer to their decision, and then you have the U.S. Supreme Court. Well, the federal district court, what happened here, Susan Barker, who was a special ed teacher at the Riverside County Board of Education, kept complaining, she and several others, about how the Riverside County Office of Education was just really screwing over these kids. And so eventually, because they wouldn't listen, they got together and filed a compliance complaint with the California Department of Education. Then all of a sudden, Susan Barker started getting crappy performance evaluations. She started not being invited to meetings. They started just making life impossible for her, so basically she just had to leave. As the law says, they constructively dismissed her. Constructive dismissal is like if they put your office under a drain pipe and the water's dripping on your head, even if they don't fire you, they dismissed you. So she sued, and the federal district court said, well, you know, she's not a disabled person, so she doesn't have any standing here, because it's only about disabled persons. It was surprising, because the regulation is very clearly opposite to that. So they took it to the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit said, if you're associated with a handicapped person or a disabled person, depending on where you're looking, whether you're a parent, whether you're a teacher, whether you're somebody who's advocating for them, if they're retaliating against you, it's like retaliating against a kid. So they retaliated against Susan Barker, and the retaliation provisions kicked in. She was entitled to financial damages and relief under 504 and the ADA. And so at that point, Susan Barker and RCOE settled up, and RCOE spent a lot, they gave her a lot of money. So I guess now they're probably behaving better. School staff can use this. If you go and if you're a teacher and you're suffering in your classroom because the principal doesn't want you referring a kid for special education, you refer the kid for special education anyway. The principal gives you a lot of crap. You make sure that you document it, and they're going to be in a lot of trouble.
Excuse me. Where's your after-school program?
I have no idea.
After-school program with the Saturday school.
I have no idea of that either.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you.
You can stay here as far as we're concerned, but not being up. So we've had some experiences of retaliation which we've worked out. One of the silliest ones was we had an IEP meeting where the gym teacher was insisting on giving writing assignments as makeups in a PE class. And the kid had trouble writing. It was a torment for her to write. And so we forced them to agree that they couldn't do that. That they actually had to give the girl PE as a makeup for missing PE classes. The woman was furious, and she ran out of there. She found the kid and started yelling at her and calling her names.